All right, let's get right into it. All around the world, you've got these major powers that seem like they're under incredible strain. But the biggest threat, it isn't always from the outside. Sometimes the most dangerous cracks are the ones that start deep within.
So these words were spoken by Vladimir Putin just this past January. He's giving this speech to a room full of foreign ambassadors, and the whole thing is just weirdly quiet. It's meant to be a message of calm, of control, a very carefully built image for the rest of the world to see.
And that right there is the real question, isn't it? That's what we're going to dig into. We're going to pull back that official curtain and take a hard look at the reality hiding behind it, a reality where the very foundations of state power are starting to shake under the weight of their own decisions.
So first up, let's talk about that image of strength that Russia is trying so hard to project. Because, well, it's starting to look pretty worn out.
Now, what's so telling about this speech isn't just the words, it's the delivery. People who were there said Putin looked exhausted, like he was just mechanically reading off these giant print cards. The whole performance was just flat. It had none of his usual energy, which is a pretty stark contrast when you think about the seriousness of what's happening on the world stage. Okay, so behind that tired facade, there is an economic pressure cooker that is seriously building up steam. Let's get into the numbers.
And look, this isn't just some wild guess. This data comes directly from Russia's own Ministry of Finance. What it shows is a catastrophic freefall in oil and gas money, and that is the absolute lifeblood of their entire federal budget. We're talking a loss of over 2.5 trillion rubles in 1 year. That's a massive, massive hole.
So how do you try to plug a hole that big? Well, it looks like they're selling off the family jewels. To keep the currency stable and just to cover their bills, the Kremlin is now dumping its gold and foreign currency reserves at more than 2.5 times the normal rate. I mean, you just can't keep that up for long. That is not a sustainable plan.
And this rot, it goes way deeper than just raw materials. Take a look at the domestic market for microelectronics. The tiny chips that are essential for everything from your washing machine to a missile's guidance system. That market shrank by a quarter in a single year. That points to a much, much deeper decay setting into their industrial base. So here's the crucial question. How does all this economic pain actually affect the average person living there? The answer, unfortunately, is a quiet, unfolding catastrophe. It's like a systematic breakdown of the state's most basic promises to its people. It really boils down to a very deliberate choice. With less and less money to go around, the state has made a decision: fund the war effort by systematically defunding its own population. They're basically sacrificing public health and welfare for their geopolitical goals.
Researchers have actually mapped this out. There's this chilling, predictable model for how a society's healthcare just comes apart. First, you cut funding for expensive, non-contagious things like cancer treatments. Then you cut funding for infectious diseases. Before long, the whole professional system, things we take for granted like pharmacies, starts to fail. And the final step, you're basically sliding back to a pre-modern age of medicine. And in Russia, we are seeing stage 2 of this model play out right now. You've got up to 3 million people living with HIV, and the state has slashed funding for the antiretroviral drugs they need to survive. This doesn't just abandon the people who are already sick, it basically guarantees the virus will spread faster. It creates this awful, vicious cycle of more infections, which need more funding, which the state is refusing to provide. And now we're seeing stage 3. This is the real canary in the coal mine. Pharmacies, they should be a bulletproof business during a health crisis, right? But across Russia, they're failing. Why? Well, it's a perfect storm. Pharmacists are getting drafted, sanctions have wrecked the supply chains, the government is forcing them to sell at prices that make it impossible to stay in business, and on top of it all, regular people are just too poor to afford medicine anyway. When the pharmacies start to close, the system is in deep, deep trouble. But here's the thing. This pattern, where a government's choices create these deep fractures within its own country, it's not just happening in Russia. All over the world, even in the most powerful Western nations, we're seeing these incredible social and political pressures just bubbling up to the surface, revealing cracks of a totally different kind. Let's take the United States, for example. There's this old, kind of obscure and very controversial law called the Insurrection Act. It basically gives the president the power to use the military against American citizens on American soil. It's supposed to be an absolute last resort, a sign that normal civilian control is completely breaking down.
And pretty recently, that once unthinkable option was actually put on the table. President Trump's threat to use this axe to handle civil unrest, well, it shows you just how deep the political divides in the country have become. It's a different kind of fracture, right? It's not economic, it's political. But it shows that even the world's leading democracy is dealing with its own internal breaking point. Because ultimately, all of this, the economics, the politics, it all comes down to the real world's human impact on ordinary people. People who are just caught in the middle between the grand ambitions of their leaders and the collapse of the systems they were supposed to be able to count on. In Ukraine, after wave of attacks on the country's power grid, the reality on the ground is just grim. In the capital, Kyiv, it's freezing. People don't have heat in their apartments, so they're gathering outside on the streets, grilling food just to get some warmth and to be together. It's an incredible display of human resilience, but it's an absolute tragedy that it's even necessary. But that tragedy has this brutal symmetry. Just over the border, in the Russian city of Belgorod, the consequences of the war have come home to roost. After their own infrastructure was hit in retaliatory strikes, Russian citizens are now being evacuated from their own freezing homes, sleeping on cots set up in local schools. The price of this war is now being paid by civilians on both sides of the border.
And that leads us right back to our central question. From Moscow to Minneapolis, states are being stretched thin. The systems people rely on are failing, and ordinary people are paying the price. So as these nations continue to fracture from the inside out, you just have to wonder, what and where is the final breaking point?